It was a cold, damp evening in Seattle, a city known for its rain. But tonight, the storm clouds seemed especially ominous. The streets were slick with rain, and the air hung heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and distant ocean spray. Selena, a young woman in her mid-twenties, found herself wandering aimlessly through the city streets, the remnants of her recent heartbreak still raw and festering within her. She had moved to Seattle for love, but that love had shattered, leaving her adrift in a sea of loneliness. Her friends had all but vanished, busy with their own lives, and tonight she could no longer bear the oppressive silence of her empty apartment. The neon lights of a pub flickered in the distance, casting an eerie, inviting glow that cut through the darkness like a beacon. Selena's feet carried her toward it almost involuntarily, driven by a desperate need to escape her own thoughts. The pub was one of those places you'd easily pass by without a second glance, nestled between a laundromat and an old bookstore. The sign above the door read, "The Last Call," in faded, chipped paint. Inside, the pub was dimly lit, with a kind of murky atmosphere that swallowed people whole. The low hum of conversations, clinking glasses, and the distant, melancholic tunes of a jukebox created a strange comfort. Selena slid onto a bar stool, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the counter as she ordered a drink. It wasn't long before the alcohol began to numb the edges of her pain, each sip a temporary balm for her wounded heart. As the hours slipped by, Selena's loneliness began to feel like a distant memory, dulled by the warmth of the liquor coursing through her veins. She didn't notice the man who had taken a seat next to her until he spoke, his voice smooth and warm, like honey laced with something just a bit darker. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone friendly yet strangely intense. Selena glanced at him, her vision slightly blurred, but she could make out the details of his face. He was handsome in a nondescript way, brown hair, brown eyes, a clean-shaven face with a disarming smile. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, yet there was something about his presence that seemed to cut through the fog of her inebriation. "Yeah," she replied, her voice heavy with the weight of the past few weeks. "Just needed to get out of my head, you know?" He nodded, a sympathetic look in his eyes. "I get it. Sometimes it's good to be around people, even if you don't know them. It helps to forget, at least for a little while." There was something comforting about his words, and Selena found herself talking to him more than she had spoken to anyone in weeks. His name was Daniel, or at least that's what he said. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her, asking her about her life, her interests, and listening intently to every word. It was nice to be heard, to feel like she mattered, even if just for a moment. As the night wore on, Selena lost track of time. The pub began to empty out, the crowd thinning as the night deepened. She was drunker than she realized, her thoughts a blur, her limbs heavy. Daniel noticed and suggested they leave together. He could get her home safely, he assured her. In her inebriated state, Selena didn't question it. The warmth in his eyes, the steady tone of his voice, it all felt safe. And wasn't that what she wanted? To feel safe, if only for a little while. She nodded, stumbling slightly as she got off the stool. He caught her, his grip firm yet gentle, guiding her toward the door. Outside, the rain had intensified, the drops pounding against the pavement like tiny bullets. Daniel led her to his car, a dark sedan parked just around the corner. He opened the passenger door for her, helping her inside. Selena slumped into the seat, her head spinning as she tried to stay awake, tried to keep her thoughts from slipping away entirely. The car ride was quiet, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof lulling her into a stupor. She didn't notice that they weren't heading toward her apartment until the car turned onto a narrow, winding road she didn't recognize. Confusion flickered through her foggy mind, but before she could question it, the car stopped. They were in a secluded area, the kind of place you wouldn't stumble upon unless you knew where you were going. Panic began to creep into Selena's mind, cutting through the haze of alcohol. She turned to Daniel, her voice shaky. This isn't the way to my place." Daniel's expression shifted, the warm smile fading into something colder, more calculating. "I know," he replied, his voice devoid of the friendliness it had held before. Selena's heart began to race, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the seatbelt, trying to unbuckle it, trying to escape. But her fingers were clumsy, and Daniel was faster. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and for the first time, Selena felt the true weight of her helplessness. She was trapped. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything to get away. But her body wouldn't respond, the alcohol still muddling her movements. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, the sense of dread wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Daniel leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "You're going to be quiet now," he whispered, his voice low and menacing. "If you scream, if you fight, it's only going to be worse for you." Selena's breath hitched in her throat, terror clawing at her insides. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but the fear had paralyzed her, rendering her a prisoner in her own body. Daniel let go of her wrist, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, shining object. It took her a moment to realize it was a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. He pressed the blade to her throat, just enough to make her feel the cold, sharp edge. "Understand?" Selena nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater still clinging to her skin. She was trembling uncontrollably, her mind a chaotic mess of fear and despair. How had she gotten here? How had she let herself trust him? The questions swirled in her mind, but there were no answers, only the cold, hard reality that she was completely and utterly at his mercy. Daniel forced her out of the car, the knife still pressed to her throat as he led her through the trees, the ground beneath her feet turning from pavement to wet, squelching earth. The rain had soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone, but the cold was nothing compared to the icy terror coursing through her veins. They arrived at a small, dilapidated cabin hidden deep within the woods. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the windows boarded up, the wood rotting and decayed. Daniel shoved her inside, slamming the door behind them. The interior was just as dismal as the outside, dark, musty, with the smell of damp and decay hanging in the air. He forced her onto the floor, binding her wrists and ankles with rough rope that cut into her skin. The panic had reached a fever pitch, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. She was alone with a monster, miles away from anyone who could help her, and she had no idea what he intended to do. Daniel circled her like a predator, his eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. "You're not the first, you know," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "But you'll be the most memorable." Selena's heart pounded in her chest, the terror nearly overwhelming her. She had to find a way out, but the ropes were too tight, her limbs too weak. Desperation clawed at her, driving her to speak, to try and reason with him. Please let me go," she begged, her voice shaking. "I won't tell anyone, I swear. Just let me go." Daniel's smile was chilling, devoid of any warmth or humanity. I'm afraid I can't do that. Selena, you see, you're part of a game I've been playing for a long time." His words sent a fresh wave of horror crashing over her. This wasn't just about her. She was a piece in some twisted game, a pawn to be used and discarded at his whim. She struggled against the ropes, her skin raw and bleeding, but it was no use. The more she fought, the tighter they seemed to get. Daniel pulled up a chair, sitting directly in front of her, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she couldn't. She was trapped in his gaze, unable to escape the darkness within him. "You know what the best part is?" he asked, leaning in closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "No one's looking for you. You're just another lonely girl in a big city. No family, no friends who care enough to check in. By the time they realize you're gone, you'll be nothing but a memory." Selena's mind raced, trying to find some glimmer of hope, some way out of this nightmare. But every path led to the same conclusion: there was no escape. She was going to die here, alone and terrified, and no one would ever know. The cabin seemed to close in around Selena, the walls pressing in as Daniel's words sank into her soul like venom. The realization that no one would come for her, that she was utterly alone, was a weight that threatened to crush her. She could barely breathe, the ropes cutting into her flesh with every panicked movement. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to give in to the darkness swallowing her whole. "I won't just disappear," she managed to choke out, her voice trembling yet defiant. "Someone will notice, eventually." Daniel chuckled, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down her spine. "Oh, they might notice, but by then it'll be too late. You'll just be another unsolved mystery, another case that people talk about in hushed tones, wondering what happened to poor Selena." He stood up, the knife still in his hand, and began to move around the cabin, his movements calm, methodical. Selena watched him through tear-streaked eyes, her mind racing as she tried to figure out his next move, how to survive the night, how to outlast him. There had to be something she could do, some way to turn the tables on him. She couldn't just sit there and wait for death. As he rummaged through a drawer, pulling out various items, duct tape, a length of wire, Selena noticed something small and metallic lying on the floor near the edge of the room. A blade. It wasn't much, but it was sharp, and it might be enough to cut through the ropes if she could just reach it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly, carefully began to inch toward the blade, trying to make as little noise as possible. Daniel was still distracted, muttering to himself as he prepared whatever sick game he had planned next. Selena bit her lip to keep from crying out as the ropes dug deeper into her wrists with each movement. But she couldn't stop. She had to reach it. Every second felt like an eternity, but finally, her fingers brushed against the blade. She quickly grabbed it, hiding it in the palm of her hand as Daniel turned back toward her, a sadistic smile curling his lips. "Now, where were we?" he mused, walking back to her with a roll of duct tape in one hand and the knife in the other. He leaned in close, his breath hot and rancid against her face. "This is going to hurt, Selena. But don't worry, I'll make it last. I like to savor these moments." Selena's heart was pounding in her chest as she began to work the blade against the rope, trying to saw through the coarse material without drawing attention. She had to keep him talking, had to distract him while she worked. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling but laced with the tiniest hint of anger. "Why me?" Daniel tilted his head, as if considering the question. "Why not you?" he replied with a shrug. "You were there, alone, vulnerable. You were perfect." His answer was infuriating in its simplicity, in its cold disregard for her life. She ground her teeth together, sawing faster, feeling the rope beginning to fray beneath the sharp edge of the blade. She was running out of time. Daniel reached for the duct tape, tearing off a strip and moving toward her mouth. "Don't want you screaming now, do we?" Just as he reached out to place the tape over her mouth, Selena felt the rope finally give way. She had to act fast. Without a moment's hesitation, she lashed out with her newly freed hand, driving the blade deep into his arm. Daniel screamed in pain and surprise, stumbling back and dropping the tape and knife. It was her only chance. Selena kicked out with all her strength, knocking him off balance, and scrambled to her feet, yanking at the rope still binding her legs. Her hands were shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she managed to tear herself free. Daniel was already recovering, his face twisted in a mask of rage as he pulled the blade from his arm, blood streaming down his sleeve. "You're going to regret this," he roared, lunging toward her. Selena bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back as she ran, her legs screaming in protest, her mind screaming at her to move faster. The rain outside was still pouring, but she didn't care. She needed to get as far away from that cabin, from Daniel, as possible. But the woods were dark, the trees closing in around her as she stumbled through the underbrush. The wet ground threatened to trip her at every turn, but she kept going, driven by sheer terror. Behind her, she could hear Daniel crashing through the trees, his shouts growing louder as he chased after her. She had no idea where she was, no sense of direction in the inky blackness of the forest. Every step felt like it could be her last. Every sound made her heart race faster. The fear was overwhelming, but she couldn't stop. If she stopped, he would catch her, and she knew there would be no second chances. Suddenly, her foot caught on something, and she went sprawling to the ground, her hands scraping against the rough, wet earth. Pain shot through her knees, but she forced herself up, glancing behind her just in time to see Daniel's silhouette emerging from the trees, his knife gleaming in the darkness. With a scream of pure desperation, Selena pushed herself to her feet and ran again, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods seemed endless, a never-ending maze designed to trap her. But then, up ahead, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light, cutting through the darkness. A road, maybe? A way out. She forced herself to move faster, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. The light grew brighter, and she could make out the outline of a road just beyond the trees. Relief surged through her, giving her the final burst of energy she needed to break free of the woods. She burst out onto the road, her feet slipping on the wet pavement as she frantically looked around for any sign of help. In the distance, she could see headlights approaching, a car coming down the road. She ran toward it, waving her arms, screaming for help. The car slowed as it neared, the driver clearly confused by the sight of a soaked, terrified woman in the middle of the road. But Selena didn't care. She ran to the driver's side window, pounding on it with her fists. "Please, please help me," she cried, her voice raw with panic. "He's going to kill me." The driver, a middle-aged man with a look of shock on his face, quickly unlocked the door. "Get in," he shouted. Selena scrambled into the car, slamming the door behind her just as Daniel burst out of the woods, his face twisted in fury. He ran toward the car, but the driver hit the gas, the tires screeching on the wet pavement as they sped away, leaving Daniel standing in the rain, his figure growing smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. Selena collapsed into the seat, sobbing uncontrollably, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion and relief. She was safe. She had escaped, but the terror of that night would never leave her. The driver, clearly shaken, kept glancing at her as he drove. "Do you need to go to the hospital? The police?" Selena nodded weakly. "The police. Please, just get me to the police." The man nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he drove as fast as he could toward the nearest town. Selena stared out the window, the rain still pouring down, her mind a whirl of fear, relief, and disbelief. She had escaped the monster in the woods, but she knew she would never be truly free of the horror she had endured. The image of Daniel's twisted smile, the feel of the knife at her throat, the cold, dead look in his eyes, they would haunt her forever. And somewhere in the darkness of the woods, she knew Daniel was still out there, waiting, watching, ready to play his sick game with someone else. But not with her. Never again. If you enjoyed this chilling story, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, stay safe and always remember, the real horrors are often closer than you think.